My sons brought a low-level thug to my house to intimidate me into signing over my businesses. It's time for us to take over, Ma, they said, gesturing to the muscle. I just looked at the thug and asked, does the Don still kiss the ring of the Black Orchid? The man's blood ran cold. He dropped to his knees begging for forgiveness. My sons thought they were taking over a few cash-only laundromats, but they had just tried to stage a coup in the city's most powerful crime family until... Before we continue, I just want to say thank you for taking the time to hear my story. If you're comfortable, let me know where you're listening from, and what time it is where you are. Now let me tell you my story. The late afternoon sun filtered through the broad, waxy leaves of the magnolia trees, dappling the flagstones of the courtyard with shifting patterns of gold. In the center of this lush, cloistered world, my world, a wrought iron table was set of a quiet, dangerous precision. On it sat 3 small plates, each a perfect crescent of seared Gulf shrimp, resting on a bed of forbidden rice risotto, adorned with a single glistening drop of chili oil. This was my life now, a life of curated beauty, of flavors balanced and refined, a world away from the one I had clawed my way out of, brick by bloody brick. I was Saraphina Jones, and this was my kingdom, a sprawling Garden District mansion in New Orleans, bought and paid for with the profits from a legitimate and very successful hospitality empire. But the instincts that had built the first darker kingdom had never truly left me. I saw the world in angles, in vulnerabilities, in the subtle tells of the men sitting across from me. My sons. Damien, my eldest at 35, held a fork but didn't eat. He was staring at his phone, his thumb flicking impatiently across the screen, a nervous, jittery energy radiating from him. His tailored suit, a shade of blue too bright for the old-world elegance of the courtyard, looked stiff and out of place. He was a man perpetually dissatisfied with the present, always chasing a flashier, more explosive future he believed was his birthright. He saw my patience not as a virtue but as a flaw, a sign of age. Caleb, 4 years his junior, at least made a show of tasting the dish. He chewed thoughtfully, his gaze shifting from his plate to me, then to his brother, a human barometer of the shifting pressures in the room. He was softer than Damien, more content, but that contentment had made him weak, susceptible to his brother's poisonous ambition. He still had a boy's eagerness to please, a trait that in a child is charming, but in a man of 31 is a liability. The chili oil needs a touch more smoke, chef, I said softly, my voice carrying easily across the courtyard to the man waiting by the French doors. He nodded, making a note on his pad, his expression one of pure, focused respect. Chef Antoine Robichaud was one of the finest culinary talents in the city, and he worked for me not just for the salary but because he knew I understood that perfection is found in the details. Damien let out an exasperated sigh, the sound grating in the tranquil air. He set his phone down with a clatter. Ma, are we done playing with shrimp? We have actual business to discuss. Real business, not dinner party menus. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my iced tea, letting the silence stretch. It was a tool I had perfected long ago, in rooms far less pleasant than this one. People, especially impatient men, rushed to fill a silence, and in their haste, they always revealed too much. I watched him, my gaze placid. He thought this was a boardroom. He didn't understand that for me, everywhere was a boardroom. The menus, as you call them, Damien, are the heart of a $50 million a year business. I said, my voice as cool and smooth as the glass in my hand. A business that pays for the suit you're wearing and the German car you drove here. So, you will show the chef, and his shrimp, the proper respect. Now, what is this real business that has you so agitated? He leaned forward, his eyes alight with the feverish glow of a new idea. I had a meeting with some investors from Miami. They're looking to partner on a new venture, a high-end nightclub in the warehouse district. 3 floors, rooftop pool, VIP lounges with cryo chambers, the works. Membership will be an NFT. It's revolutionary. I listened, my expression unchanging. I already knew about the Miami investors. My sources had informed me of the meeting before Damien had even booked his flight. My sources were not corporate spies, but an old network of whispers and loyalties that still pulsed beneath the city's skin. A valet, a bellhop, a woman who cleaned offices late at night. They saw everything. I also knew these investors were leveraged to the hilt, and were looking for a legacy name, a clean partner, secure their financing. They were sharks, and my son, my brilliant, foolish son, was chumming the water with my name. When he finished his breathless pitch, I picked up a linen napkin and dabbed my lips. No, I said. The word was quiet, but it landed with the force of a physical blow. Damien recoiled, his face flushing a deep, angry red. No? Just like that? You didn't even hear the numbers. The projections are insane. I don't need to hear the numbers, I said calmly. The numbers are a fantasy. The reality is this. The building they're proposing is on Giroud Street. The zoning permits for a multi-level liquor license on that block are impossible unless you have Councilman Miller in your pocket. You don't. I do. And he owes me for a certain indiscretion involving his aide and a Mardi Gras float. But he won't approve a nightclub. The liquor distribution for that part of the district is controlled by the Marcello family, who will expect a 20% tribute off the books, just to let your trucks unload, a tribute you would never think to pay. And finally, the investors from Miami, the Moretti brothers, are one bad deal away from bankruptcy after their crypto scheme imploded last month. They aren't looking for a partner, Damien. They are looking for a lifeboat, and I will not have my name, the name your father and I built, tied to that sinking ship. Every word was a precise, surgical cut, dismantling his grand vision piece by piece. I wasn't just guessing, I was stating facts. This was the difference between us. He saw a glittering facade. I saw the rotten foundation beneath. He saw a revolutionary business model. I saw 3 different ways to end up in a federal indictment or at the bottom of the Mississippi. He stared at me, his jaw clenched so tightly a muscle jumped. He saw my logic not as wisdom but as an obstacle. As weakness. Caleb was looking at his plate, pushing a single grain of rice around with his fork as if it held the secrets to the universe. You've lost your nerve, Damien finally spat, his voice dripping with contempt. You're so afraid of losing what you have that you can't see what we could build. You're content to sit here and play with menus while an empire rots. He stood up, throwing his napkin onto the table. It landed next to his untouched shrimp. Caleb, let's go. Caleb looked at me, a flicker of apology in his eyes, before standing to follow his brother, the loyal lieutenant in a fool's rebellion. I watched them walk away. 2 boys dressed in men's clothes, their shoulders stiff with a manufactured indignation. I knew, with the certainty of a storm gathering on the horizon, that this was not the end of it. Damien's ambition left to fester was a dangerous thing. It was a sickness in my house. I looked down at the browning spot on my prize orchid that morning. The rot was spreading faster than I had thought. And I knew, with a weary hollow ache in my chest, a cure was going to be painful. The view from Damien's condo was a perfect lie. From the 30th floor, New Orleans was a glittering, orderly carpet of light, the chaotic, pulsing soul of the city rendered sterile and silent behind a wall of floor-to-ceiling glass. The apartment itself was a monument to his aspirations. Cold leather furniture, chrome accents, and a massive, abstract painting that was all sharp angles and no heart. It was a space designed to impress, not to be lived in. It was a showroom for a man who didn't exist. An empire rots, Damien repeated, pacing in front of the window, his reflection a ghostly twin striding across the city. Did you hear her, Caleb? She's talking about zoning permits and tribute to some dusty old mobsters. The Marcello family. This isn't 1985. The world has changed. You don't pay tribute, you become the one people pay. Caleb sank into one of the leather sofas, which sighed under his weight. He looked small and out of place in the cavernous room, a man drowning in his brother's ambition. I don't know, man. She knew a lot of details. She even knew the name of the councilman. How does she do that? Damien stopped pacing and fixed his younger brother with a pitying look. Because she's built a world around herself based on fear and favors. It's all she knows. She's stuck in the past. Caleb, of course you've never heard of the Marcellos. Because Mom has kept us in a gilded cage our entire lives. She's fed us this bedtime story about how she and Dad started with a few cash-only laundromats in the trim, saved up and built this clean, respectable business. And you believe it? It's the truth, isn't it? Caleb asked, his voice laced with an uncertainty that Damien immediately seized upon. It's a truth, Damien said, lowering his voice, making it conspiratorial. It's the part of the story she wants us to know. The part that lets her sit on the board of the museum and have tea with the mayor's wife. But you don't build what she built. Not in this city, just by washing other people's clothes. She was tough. I'll give her that. She had to be. But that fire is gone, Caleb. All that's left are the ashes. She's a relic, and she's holding us back. He walked over to a sleek, minimalist bar and poured 2 glasses of an expensive, smoky scotch. He handed one to Caleb, who took it automatically. The amber liquid seemed to glow with a malevolent light in the dim room. Think about it, Damien continued, his voice smooth and seductive as a jazz clarinet. We're the face of the company. I'm the one taking the meetings. You're the one running the flagship. But at the end of the day we're just employees. We have to ask for permission. We have to present our ideas to her like we're children at a science fair, just so she can shoot them down with some old-world paranoia. He took a sip of his scotch, letting the argument hang in the air. He was a master manipulator and Caleb was his most pliable subject. He was preying on a lifetime of Caleb's quiet resentments, the small slights, the feeling of always being the younger, less important son. She treats us like children because she doesn't respect us, Damien said, his voice now a low, angry growl. She doesn't think we're capable. She's never going to willingly hand over the reins. Not ever. She'd rather let the whole thing crumble into dust than admit that her time is over and ours has begun. Caleb swirled the liquid in his glass. So what are we supposed to do? Just wait for her to die? The question was crass but it was honest, and it was the opening Damien had been waiting for. No, Damien said, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his face. We don't wait. We accelerate her retirement. He walked over to a steel briefcase leaning against the wall, and brought it to the coffee table. He opened it with 2 decisive clicks. Inside, nestled on a bed of dark satin was a thick leather-bound folder. I had my lawyer draw these up a month ago, he said, pulling the folder out. It's a full transfer of all business assets, a transfer of power. She signs these and the Viocare Hospitality Group belongs to us. We become the board. She gets a generous pension and the title of founder emeritus. She can play with her menus and her gardenias for the rest of her life, and we can finally start building a real empire. Caleb stared at the documents, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and awe. It was so audacious, so final. She'll never sign this. You know she won't. She'd laugh in our faces. She won't be laughing, Damien said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, not with the kind of encouragement I have in mind. What does that mean? Caleb asked, a knot of real fear tightening in his stomach. Damien, she's our mother, and we are her sons. Damien shot back, his voice rising with a sudden sharp passion. We are her legacy. This isn't about hurting her, Caleb. It's about saving us. It's about taking what is rightfully ours before she runs it into the ground with her timid, old-fashioned ways. All she needs is a little push. A demonstration that the world is a dangerous place and that she isn't in control anymore. She just needs to be reminded that she's a 62-year-old woman alone in a big house. He closed the briefcase, the sound echoing in the sterile room. I've already made a call. I'm meeting someone tomorrow. A professional who can help us with the persuasion. Caleb said nothing. He just stared into his glass at the distorted reflection of a man he barely recognized. He felt a deep, gut-wrenching shame. A feeling so potent it almost made him sick, but beneath it another feeling flickered. A small, greedy spark of excitement. Imagine it. Real control. No more asking for permission. No more living under her long, elegant shadow. No more being the little brother. He took a long swallow of the scotch. It burned all the way down, a welcome fire that cauterized his guilt and hardened his resolve. Okay, he heard himself say, his voice a stranger's. Okay, let's do it. Damien smiled, the reflection in the window smiling with him. A king surveying a city he was about to conquer. Damien believed himself a player in the grand theater of New Orleans' power. But he was, in truth, a man who had only ever bought tickets to the show. He didn't know the producers, the directors, or the shadowy figures who worked the ropes backstage. His attempt to source muscle was a perfect illustration of his amateur status. He didn't have a direct line to the city's real enforcers. He had to go through channels, starting with a man named Antoine Devereaux, a real estate developer with a gambling problem whom Damien had met at a high-stakes poker game. Devereaux owed Damien money, a fact Damien believed gave him leverage. He called him and made his request, couching it in vague, corporate-sounding language. I need a consultant, he'd said, for a sensitive negotiation, someone with a persuasive presence. Devereaux, eager to clear his debt, had readily agreed. I know a guy, he'd said. He's connected, reliable, a bit of a hothead, but he gets the job done. The meeting was set not in a fancy steakhouse or a private club, but in the back room of a dingy Paul boy shop in the Marais, a neighborhood whose grit was a far cry from Damien's polished world. The air in the room was thick with the smell of stale beer and fried oysters, A single bare bulb hung from the ceiling, casting a sickly yellow light on the peeling linoleum floor. Damien and Caleb sat at a rickety card table, both looking deeply uncomfortable in their expensive suits. This was a world they did not understand, a language they did not speak, and their unease was a palpable stench in the small room. The door creaked open and the man stepped inside. He was younger than they expected, maybe late 20s, with a wiry, restless energy. He wore a tracksuit, a gold chain thick as a finger around his neck, and a pair of sunglasses despite the dim light. He moved with a coiled, arrogant swagger, his eyes sweeping over the two brothers, taking in their expensive watches and their soft, manicured hands. He was utterly unimpressed. "You the Jones boys?" he asked, his voice a low, gravelly drawl. He didn't wait for an answer. He pulled a chair out, scraping it loudly against the floor, and sat down, leaning back so it balanced on two legs. "I'm Rico. Devereaux said you had a job for me." Damien, trying to reclaim some semblance of authority, straightened his tie. "That's right. We have a business matter that requires a certain finesse." Rico let out a short, humorless laugh. "People don't call me for finesse, brah. They call me when they need a hammer." "So what you need hammered?" Caleb shifted nervously in his chair. Damien, however, seemed to warm to the language. He was playing gangster now. He leaned forward, lowering his voice. "It's a family matter. My mother, Saraphina Jones. She's stubborn. We need her to sign some papers, transfer some assets. She's holding up progress." Rico took off his sunglasses and for the first time they saw his eyes. They were cold, flat, and devoid of any emotion other than a bored, calculating avarice. "Saraphina Jones," he repeated, testing the name. "The hotel lady from the Garden District?" "The same," Damien confirmed. "She lives alone in that big house. The job is simple. We go there, you stand behind us. You look intimidating. You make her understand that this isn't a request. You make her feel the pressure. Feel her age. Make her understand that her world isn't as safe as she thinks it is." Rico listened, a slow, lazy smirk spreading across his face. This was a cakewalk, a milk run. Scare some rich old lady for her spoiled rotten sons. He'd done worse for a fraction of what they were probably paying. "She got security?" Rico asked. A practical question. "An old man who doubles as a gardener and a system that's probably 20 years old." Damien said with a dismissive wave. "It's nothing." He was so confident, so sure of his assessment. He had no idea that my true security wasn't electronic. It was a reputation built on blood, fear, and unwavering loyalty. Rico's smirk widened. "All right, sounds easy enough. But my boss, he's gotta get his taste." "Your boss?" Caleb piped up, his voice barely a whisper. "Yeah, my boss," Rico said, his cold eyes flicking to Caleb, making him shrink back in his chair. "I work for Isaiah Thorne. You heard of him?" Damien and Caleb exchanged a look. Of course they'd heard of him. Isaiah Thorne was the city's boogeyman, the man who had consolidated power in the underworld after a period of chaos years ago. His name was whispered in news articles about union disputes and backroom political deals. To them he was a concept, a headline, not a person they would ever have to deal with. Damien, trying to appear unfazed, nodded. "Of course. His commission will be handled." He slid a thick envelope across the table. "This is half, you get the other half when she signs." Rico picked up the envelope, not bothering to count it. He hefted its weight in his hand. "Satisfied. Pleasure doing business with you," he said, standing up. "You let me know when it's time to go to work." He put his sunglasses back on and walked out, leaving the two brothers alone in the dim, smelly room. "See?" Damien said, his voice brimming with a false confidence. "Easy. The man is a professional. A tool. We point him in the right direction. He does his job and we get what we want." Caleb said nothing. He just looked at the door Rico had exited through, a cold dread seeping into his bones. They hadn't just hired a thug, they had knocked on the door of Isaiah Thorne's world. And he had a terrible feeling that they had just invited a monster into their home. While my sons were conspiring in the cold, sterile world of glass and steel, I was in my own sanctuary, a humid, fragrant paradise of glass and life. My greenhouse tucked away behind the main house was my true office, the place where I did my most important work. It was where I came to think, to plan, to remember. The air inside was thick and warm, smelling of damp earth, peat moss, and the intoxicating otherworldly perfume of my orchids. Hundreds of them in every conceivable shape and color lined the long wooden benches. Tending to them was a form of meditation, a ritual of patience and meticulous care that centered my soul. Each plant was a living thing, with its own needs. You couldn't rush an orchid, you couldn't bully it into blooming. You had to understand it, give it exactly what it needed, the right light, the right humidity, the right touch, and then you had to be patient. It was a lesson in power that my sons had never bothered to learn. At the very back of the greenhouse, in a specially climate-controlled section, was my private collection, my sanctum sanctorum. Here grew the rarest of my specimens, and in the center of it all, on a solitary pedestal, was my masterpiece, the Fred Clara After Dark, the Black Orchid. Its petals were not truly black. Of course, they were a shade of deep, unholy burgundy so dark they consumed the light, appearing as voids in the shape of a flower. They felt like cool velvet beneath my fingertips, and their scent was a complex, intoxicating blend of spice and something like sweet decay. It was a flower of breathtaking, dangerous beauty, a flower of the night. It was the perfect symbol. I had been given my first black orchid cutting 35 years ago by the man who had taken me under his wing when I was just a clever, hungry girl from the Ninth Ward with nothing to my name but a sharp mind and a survivor's instinct. His name was Marcel, the old Creole who ran the city's shadow economy from the back of his quiet antique shop. He had seen the steel in me. Some people are like roses, Saraphina, he told me, his voice like crushed rubber, all bright and beautiful but they wilt in the heat. Others are like this orchid. They draw their power from the dark. They are rare, and they are not to be trifled with. When he died he left me not only the orchid but the kingdom he had built. I had taken it and made it an empire, the names in the world that mattered, the one that operated beneath the surface of polite society. I was not Seraphina Jones. I was the Black Orchid. My husband, Antoine, had hated that name. He was a good man, a legitimate man, a jazz club owner, whose only vices were a love for good bourbon and my cooking. He had met me after I had begun my slow, careful transition into the world of light. He loved the woman I had become, but he was terrified of the woman I had been. I remembered one night, years ago, standing in this very greenhouse. Antoine had come in, his face etched with worry. An old associate of mine, a man I had long since cut ties with, had shown up at his club, trying to use my name to intimidate him into some deal. "You have to be done with it, Sarah," he had pleaded, his hands on my shoulders. "Completely, you can't ever go back. You've built this beautiful garden, don't let the weeds grow back in." I had promised him I would, for him, and for our sons. I had completed my retirement. I had installed a successor, a shrewd and ambitious man named Isaiah Thorne, and had withdrawn completely, pulling the curtain of legitimacy around my life, until the Black Orchid was nothing more than a ghost story, a myth whispered by old men in smoky bars. Now, as I gently misted the leaves of my prize orchid, I felt a familiar, unwelcome unease settle over me. It was an instinct honed by years of survival, a subtle shift in the air that signaled a coming storm. I examined the flower, my eyes tracing the perfect velvet curve of its petals, and then I saw it. On the edge of the largest, most perfect bloom was a tiny, almost imperceptible spot of brown, a blemish, a sign of sickness, of a rot starting from somewhere deep and unseen, in the roots. My blood ran cold. I touched the spot with the tip of my finger. It was soft, unhealthy. It was an omen, a warning. The weeds were growing back in, and they were coming from inside my own house. The day of the confrontation arrived with a suffocating heavy humidity that often preceded a summer thunderstorm. The air was still. The sky a hazy, bruised-looking gray. I had spent the morning in my office, a stately room on the ground floor with floor-to-ceiling mahogany bookshelves and windows that looked out onto the oppressive calm of the garden. I was not reviewing financials or taking calls. I was simply sitting at my large, antique desk, a relic from Marcel's shop, and I was waiting. My instincts, honed over a lifetime of navigating treacherous currents, were screaming. The storm was no longer on the horizon. It was here. My housekeeper, a formidable woman named Estelle, who had been with me for 20 years and knew more of my secrets than my own sons, entered without knocking. "Ma'am," she said, her voice low, "Mr. Damien and Mr. Caleb are here. They have a guest." Estelle's use of the word guest was laced with a disapproval so thick it was practically an insult. I knew then, this was it. "Thank you, Estelle," I said, my voice calm. "Please show them in that, and then take the rest of the afternoon for yourself. I will not need you." She gave me a long, searching look, an unspoken offer of solidarity, of whatever help a loyal housekeeper could provide. I gave her a small, reassuring nod. She understood. She bowed her head slightly and left, closing the heavy oak doors behind her, the sound a soft final thud. I folded my hands on the polished surface of the desk. On it sat a single perfect black orchid in a simple porcelain vase. I focused on its dark velvety petals as I heard the approaching footsteps. 2 sets confident and familiar, the third heavy, clumsy and out of place. The doors opened, and they entered. My sons. Damien led the way, his face a mask of grim determination, a man playing a role he had rehearsed 100 times in the mirror. He was clutching a leather-bound folder to his chest like a shield. Caleb followed a step behind, his eyes darting around the room, unable to meet my gaze. He looked like a boy who had been dragged to the principal's office, guilt and fear warring on his soft features. And behind them, filling the doorway, was their guest. He was exactly what I had expected, a low-level instrument of intimidation. He was young, dressed in a loud, expensive tracksuit that was an affront to the quiet elegance of my home. A thick gold chain rested on his chest. He was chewing gum, the motion slow and insolent. He was trying to project an aura of casual menace, but I could see the nervous energy thrumming beneath his skin. He was a stray dog, all bark, who had wandered into a lion's den and didn't even know it yet. "Money," Damien began, his voice straining to sound authoritative. He and Caleb stood before my desk, a parody of a corporate delegation. Their thug, this Rico, lingered by the door, trying to look imposing, his arms crossed over his chest. The entire scene was so transparently foolish, so utterly amateur, that it would have been laughable if it wasn't so profoundly sad. "Damien? Caleb," I said, my tone even. I did not invite them to sit. I did not acknowledge the man by the door. I simply looked at my eldest son, my gaze level and patient. Damien took a deep breath, puffed out his chest, and placed the folder on my desk. "We're here to talk about the future of the company," he announced. "Caleb and I have decided it's time for a change in leadership. It's time for us to take over, Ma." He gestured vaguely with his head toward the man by the door. "This is happening one way or another. We're hoping for a smooth, peaceful transition. For the good of the family. For the good of the family." The words hung in the air, a grotesque perversion of the loyalty and love that a family should represent. He had brought a thug, a common street animal, into my home to threaten me, his own mother, and he was cloaking it in the language of filial duty. The disappointment I felt was a cold physical weight in my chest, heavier than any anger. I had raised them in a palace, given them everything Antoine and I had fought for, and in doing so I had raised them soft. I had given them the fruits of the empire without ever teaching them the blood it had cost to build it. This was my failure as much as it was theirs. I let the silence sit for a long moment, my eyes never leaving Damien's face. I watched the bravado begin to crack, the uncertainty flicker in his eyes. He was expecting a reaction, tears, anger, fear. He was not prepared for my stillness. Finally I moved. But I did not look at the folder. I did not look at my sons. My gaze shifted, slowly, deliberately, and landed for the first time on the man by the door. This Rico. I looked at him, and I mean I truly looked at him. My gaze was not a glance. It was an assessment, an appraisal, as cool and thorough as a coroner's. I took in the cheap gold, the nervous tick in his jaw from the gum, the way he shifted his weight from one foot to the other. He was a tool, and a blunt one at that. But every tool has a maker, and I needed to know who had forged this one. My office was silent, save for the soft, rhythmic ticking of the antique grandfather clock in the corner. A sound that had measured out the peaceful years of my retirement. Now, it seemed to be counting down the seconds to a war I had never wanted to fight again. Damien's declaration of his coup still hung in the air, thick and rancid. He and Caleb stood before my desk, waiting. They were boys playing with matches in a house built of dry timber, and they were about to learn what a real fire felt like. My sons were a problem, but they were a known quantity. Their weaknesses, their ambitions, their foolish pride. I knew them all as intimately as I knew my own heartbeat. But the man by the door, this swaggering piece of rented muscle, he was the variable. He was the outside contamination they had introduced into our closed system. And before I dealt with the sickness within my family, I had to identify the plague at my door. I leaned back slightly in my leather chair, a deliberate, almost casual movement. My eyes remained fixed on Rico. He felt my gaze on him, a tangible pressure, and he shifted uncomfortably, his tough guy facade beginning to crack under the silent analytical weight of my attention. He was used to being the source of intimidation, not the subject of it. "You," I said, my voice quiet but cutting through the silence like a razor. It was the first time I had acknowledged his existence. "What is your name?" He was momentarily thrown. He glanced at Damien as if looking for a cue, but my son was just as frozen, caught in the grip of a power dynamic he didn't understand. "Rico," he finally managed to say, his voice a low growl that was meant to sound menacing but only sounded strained. "Rico," I repeated, tasting the name. It was a common street name, a name for a pawn. "And who do you work for, Rico? Who sent a boy like you to do a man's work in my house?" He puffed out his chest, a reflexive act of bravado. "I work for Isaiah Thorne," he said, invoking the name like a talisman, a shield he thought would protect him. He expected the name of the city's current don to frighten me, to establish his credentials. It was a fatal miscalculation. He had just handed me the key to the entire situation. Isaiah Thorne, the ambitious man I had personally chosen to succeed me 10 years ago, the man who owed his entire kingdom to my peaceful abdication. A slow, cold understanding dawned in my mind. My sons hadn't just hired a thug, they had in their infinite ignorance borrowed a piece of my own empire to try and conquer me with it. The sheer tragic irony of it was almost too much to bear. I allowed a small, cold smile to touch my lips. It did not reach my eyes. "Isaiah Thorne," I said, my voice a soft, musing whisper. "I remember when he was just a hungry boy running messages in the quarter. He was clever, but he never forgot his lessons. I wonder if he still remembers the most important one." I leaned forward, my hands flat on the desk, my gaze locked onto Rico's. The time for assessment was over. It was time to remind this child, and by extension my sons, what real power was. It was not in a folder full of legal papers. It was not in borrowed muscle. It was in a name that had been buried for a decade, but had never lost its power. A name that still held the weight of all the secrets and all the bodies that had built this city's shadows. My voice dropped to a near whisper, a sound that was somehow more menacing than any shout. It was the sound of a tomb opening. "Tell me, Rico," I asked, the question precise and deadly. "Does the dawn still kiss the ring of the Black Orchid?" The change in the room was instantaneous and absolute. It was as if I had spoken a word of ancient dark magic. The name, the Black Orchid, hit the air and seemed to suck all the oxygen out of the room. Caleb flinched as if he'd been struck. Damien's face went slack with a sudden uncomprehending confusion. But it was Rico who had the most profound reaction. The blood physically drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly ashen gray. His jaw went slack, the wad of gum falling from his open mouth to the priceless Aubusson rug. His eyes, which had been so cold and arrogant just moments before, were now wide with a pure primal and utterly satisfying terror. The ghost stories were real. The whispers from the old-timers, the legends of the woman who had ruled the city with an iron fist and a velvet glove. The one who had vanished into myth. It was all true, and she was sitting right in front of him. He hadn't just walked into a lion's den. He had tried to put a leash on the lioness herself. The name hung in the air, a living, breathing entity, the Black Orchid. For my sons, it was a string of nonsense words, a cryptic phrase that held no meaning. But for Rico, it was the key to a door he never wanted to walk through. A door that led back to the old ways, to the foundational legends of the world he inhabited. His entire body began to tremble, a fine, uncontrollable shudder that started in his hands and radiated through his flashy tracksuit. The swagger that had defined him was gone, stripped away as if by a chemical solvent, leaving behind the raw, terrified essence of who he really was. A young man in over his head. His mind was racing, connecting the dots with the speed of panic. Saraphina Jones, the elegant, retired hotel magnate. Isaiah Thorne, his boss, the man who now ran the city, and the Black Orchid, the myth, the ghost who had handpicked Isaiah, the one who had built the entire damn machine. He suddenly understood. He hadn't been sent to threaten some rich old lady. He had been sent to commit sacrilege. The stories he'd heard in hushed reverent tones from the old-timers in Isaiah's organization came rushing back. They talked about the Orchid's reign as a golden age of discipline and order. A time when rules were rules, and the penalty for breaking them was swift and final. They said she could kill a man with a single word, that she knew every secret in the city, that her network of informants was so deep it was like she could hear the city's very thoughts. They said she had retired, faded into the world of light, but they always finished the story with the same superstitious warning. But you don't ever wake a sleeping dragon. And here he was. The stupidest punk in all of New Orleans. The one who had walked right up to the dragon's lair and tried to poke it with a stick. A low guttural sound escaped his throat, a whimper of pure animal fear. His knees, suddenly unable to support his weight, gave out. He dropped to the floor with a heavy, undignified thud, the impact jarring his entire body. He didn't just kneel, he prostrated himself. His head bowed so low his forehead nearly touched the intricate pattern of the antique rug. "Forgive me," he stammered, his voice a choked, pathetic rasp. His words tumbled out, a frantic, desperate torrent of apology. "Forgive me, Orchid. I didn't know, nobody told me it was you." The plea was existential. It was the cry of a man who knew he had just crossed a line from which there was no return. He wasn't just afraid of her, he was afraid of what Isaiah would do to him when he found out the magnitude of his screw-up. He had put his boss in an impossible position. He had violated the foundational treaty of their entire world. "Please," he begged, his voice cracking. "They told me it was a simple job. Just lean on some old lady. They said, you were just their mother." He risked a glance up, not at me but at Damien and Caleb, his eyes filled with a new burning hatred. They had done this to him. These soft, stupid boys had signed his death warrant. I watched him grovel, my face impassive. I felt no pity. Pity is a luxury, and in the world I had come from, it was a fatal one. His terror was a tool, just as his intimidation was meant to be, and I would use— "Get up," I said, my voice still quiet, but now imbued with an authority that Rico understood in his very bones. It was the voice of command. He scrambled to his feet, his movements clumsy with fear. He stood before me, head still bowed, not daring to meet my eyes, his hands clasped in front of him like a penitent sinner before the altar. I turned my gaze from him to my sons, and I watched them. If the scene unfolding before them was a play, Damien and Caleb were in the front row, holding a script written in a language they couldn't read. They were frozen in a state of profound, almost comical disbelief. Their entire plan, so carefully constructed in the sterile safety of Damien's condo, had just imploded in the most baffling way imaginable. Their weapon, their tool of intimidation, the street-tough hammer they had hired to frighten their mother into submission, was now standing before her like a chastised schoolboy, his face pale with sweat, his entire body radiating a terror so palpable it seemed to change the temperature of the room. Damien's mouth was slightly agape, his face a mask of slack-jawed confusion. He looked from the trembling Rico to me, and then back again, his brain struggling to process the scene. He was a man who believed in a simple linear equation of power. Money plus muscle equals results. My quiet cryptic question had introduced a variable he couldn't comprehend, a form of algebra that was utterly beyond him. The name Black Orchid meant nothing to him. It was a flower. It was nonsense. Yet it had just neutralized his enforcer more effectively than a tranquilizer dart. Caleb, on the other hand, looked physically ill. His face was ashen and he seemed to have shrunk inside his expensive suit. While Damien was trying to solve the puzzle, Caleb was simply reacting to the raw, terrifying emotion in the room. He didn't understand what was happening, but he understood fear when he saw it. And the fear rolling off Rico was a suffocating wave. He looked at me, his own mother, as if seeing me for the first time. The familiar, elegant woman who hosted Thanksgiving dinner and reminded him to take his vitamins had been replaced by a stranger, a calm, cold figure, who could dismantle a hardened street thug with a few quiet words. "Matt, what is this?" Damien finally managed to stammer, his voice a weak imitation of his earlier bravado. "What did you say to him? What's a Black Orchid?" I ignored his question. Answering it would be like explaining the concept of fire to an ant. It was beyond his frame of reference. Instead, I continued to direct the scene, my focus still on the broken enforcer. "You have disgraced my home, Rico," I said, my voice cutting through the tense silence. "You have disrespected my family name. And you have represented your boss, Isaiah Thorne, very, very poorly." At the mention of his boss's name, a fresh wave of terror washed over Rico. He visibly flinched. "So here is what you are going to do," I continued, my words slow and deliberate, each one a clear, non-negotiable command. "You are going to walk out of this house. You are going to go directly to your boss. And you are going to deliver a message for me, word for word. Do you understand?" Rico nodded frantically, his head bobbing up and down. "Yes, Orchid. Yes, ma'am. Anything." I leaned forward slightly, my eyes boring into him. My voice was a blade of ice. You will tell Isaiah Thorne that his boy put his hands on my house. And you will tell him that I will be calling him to discuss the matter of his tribute. And then you will tell him that orchid is very, very displeased. The phrase his tribute was a deliberate choice. It was a piece of language from the old days, a reminder of the feudal structure of power, of who was the vassal and who was the queen. Go, I said, dismissing him with a subtle, almost imperceptible wave of my hand. Now, Rico didn't need to be told twice. He practically bolted from the room, scrambling through the doorway as if the hounds of hell were at his heels. He didn't even look back at the two men who had hired him, the two fools who had led him to this slaughter. He was a man running for his life. The heavy oak doors swung shut behind him, leaving me alone with my sons in the suffocating silence. The immediate threat was gone, but the real crisis had just begun. I let the silence stretch, forcing them to stew in their confusion and dawning fear. Finally, I turned my gaze, cold and heavy as a glacier, onto my children. You thought my legacy was a few laundromats and some fancy hotels? I asked, my voice devoid of any warmth, any motherly affection. You foolish, foolish children. You have no idea what you've just done. The departure of Rico left a vacuum in the room, a void that was quickly filled by the suffocating weight of my son's ignorance and fear. The balance of power had not just shifted. The entire board upon which they thought they were playing had been revealed to be a phantom. They were standing on thin air and they were just beginning to look down. Damien, ever the one to mistake aggression for strength, was the first to speak. He tried to muster some of his earlier indignation, but it came out as a weak, sputtering protest. What the hell was that, Mom? Who was that guy? And what did you say to him? You hired him, didn't you? This was some kind of test. Some bizarre power play to scare us. He was trying to build a narrative he could understand, one where I was still the manipulative but ultimately predictable mother he knew. He couldn't grasp the alternative, that he was the one who was out of his depth. Caleb, however, was silent. He had sunk into a nearby armchair, his face pale, his hands clasped together so tightly his knuckles were white. He wasn't trying to find a logical explanation. He was simply replaying the sheer abject terror on Rico's face. He knew on a primal level that what he had just witnessed was not a test. It was real. A test, I said, my voice dangerously soft. I rose slowly from my chair, the movement fluid and deliberate. I walked around the desk, my heels clicking softly on the hardwood floor, and stood before them. I was no longer a matriarch behind a desk. I was a sovereign inspecting her failed supplicants. A test is what a teacher gives you to see what you have learned. I said, my eyes locked on Damien. I have been teaching you your entire lives, and it is clear you have learned nothing. What you just saw was a consequence. The first of many, I assure you, if you continue on this path. I picked up the leather folder from my desk. I didn't open it. I held it in my hand, its weight a symbol of their pathetic, ill-conceived ambition. You came into my house, I continued, my voice a low, controlled fury. My home. The one your father and I built. You brought a street thug, a collector for Isaiah Thorne, to intimidate me, your own mother. You did this because you believe you are ready to run an empire, but you don't even have the sense to know what kind of empire you were born into. What are you talking about? Damien demanded, his confusion warring with his pride. We know the business. It's hotels. It's restaurants. I let out a short, sharp laugh. It was not a sound of humor. It was a sound of profound, sorrowful pity. The hotels, I said, are the part of the iceberg you can see above the water. They are the beautiful, clean, respectable face of a fortune that was built on something much, much older. The laundromats. Yes, they were real. They were the first step. But they weren't for washing clothes, you foolish boy. They were for washing money. The color drained from Caleb's face. He finally understood. Damien just stared, his mouth opening and closing silently like a fish gasping for air. Marcel, the man who owned the antique shop, the one you called Uncle Marcel when you were boys? He wasn't just a family friend, I explained, my voice as patient as a teacher explaining a difficult lesson. He was my mentor. He taught me how this city really works, not the city of tourists and politicians, but the one that operates in the shadows. When he died, he left that world to me, and I ran it. I ran it for 20 years. The name they gave me in that world was the Black Orchid. I let the name settle between us, watching their faces as the horrific understanding finally dawned. Their mother, the woman who made them gumbo and checked their homework, was a ghost from the city's violent underworld. I retired, I said, my voice hardening. I installed Isaiah Thorne as my successor under very specific terms. My family, my businesses, my name, they were to be considered sacrosanct, untouchable. A legacy protected by the very organization I created, and you, in your infinite greed and arrogance, you took a piece of Isaiah's organization and you tried to use it to attack the foundation upon which it was all built. You didn't just stage a coup in my company, you just tried to stage a coup in the city's most powerful crime family. I threw the folder back onto the desk. It landed with a heavy thud. Get out of my house, I said, my voice dropping to a whisper. Both of you, and you pray. You pray that when Isaiah Thorne learns what you have done, he is in a merciful mood. Because I promise you, I will not be. The headquarters of Isaiah Thorne were not in a smoky backroom or a gaudy nightclub. They were on the top 2 floors of a sleek, anonymous office tower in the central business district. The space was a masterpiece of corporate minimalism, polished concrete floors, glass walls and a panoramic view of the city that stretched all the way to the crescent bend of the Mississippi River. It was the office of a CEO, not a crime boss, and that was precisely the point. Isaiah Thorne was a new breed of kingpin, one who understood that true power in the modern age was wielded not with a gun but with a spreadsheet and an LLC. Isaiah was in his private office, reviewing shipping manifests on a large tablet, when his second-in-command, a quiet, imposing man named Marcus, entered without knocking. We have a problem, Marcus said, his voice a low rumble. Isaiah didn't look up from his tablet. There are always problems, Marcus. That is the nature of our business. Specify. It's Rico, Marcus said. He just came back from that side job he was doing for those Jones kids. He's unwell. Isaiah finally looked up, his eyes cold and intelligent, narrowing slightly. Unwell. How? Did the old woman have more security than they thought? No, Marcus said, a strange, almost fearful reluctance in his voice. He says the old woman is the security. He says she knows you. He said to tell you, that the Orchid is very, very displeased. The name hit the air in the silent, climate-controlled office. And for a moment Isaiah Thorne, the most feared man in New Orleans, looked like he had been struck by lightning. The tablet slipped from his fingers, clattering onto the glass surface of his desk. He stood up slowly, his movements stiff, and walked to the vast window, staring down at the city below. His city, a city he had been given. The Black Orchid, he whispered, the name a strange mix of reverence and dread on his lips. After all these years, he had been just a boy when he first met her, a hungry, ambitious lieutenant in Marcel's organization. He had watched her ascend, had seen firsthand her brilliance, her strategic mind, her chilling capacity for violence when it was necessary. She was a legend, but to him she had been a mentor. She had seen the same fire in him that Marcel had seen in her. When she had decided to retire, to step into the world of light, she had summoned him to her mansion. He remembered that day perfectly. She had laid out the terms of his succession. The entire organization was his to command, with one non-negotiable condition. Her new life, her family and her legitimate businesses were to be considered a neutral territory, a sovereign nation. No one from his world was ever to touch hers. It was the price of his crown, a tribute of peace he had gladly paid for 10 years. What exactly happened, Marcus? Isaiah asked, his voice dangerously quiet, his back still to the room. Marcus recounted Rico's terrified, rambling story. The 2 arrogant sons, the folder of papers, the quiet, elegant woman in her office, and the question, does the Dunth still kiss the ring of the Black Orchid? Isaiah closed his eyes. The sheer breathtaking stupidity of it was almost incomprehensible. Those 2 pampered, ignorant fools, her own blood, had committed a sin they couldn't even understand. They had used one of his men, a piece of his own organization, to violate the one sacred treaty that kept their 2 worlds separate. It wasn't just an insult to the Orchid, it was a profound, public insult to him. It made him look weak, like a man who couldn't control his own people, like a king whose decrees were meaningless. Where is Rico now? Isaiah asked. In the waiting area. He's begging to see you. To explain? Marcus said. There is nothing to explain, Isaiah said, turning from the window. His face was a mask of cold, controlled fury. He is a fool who followed a fool's errand, but the sin is not his. The sin belongs to the sons. They have brought this chaos to my door. They have invoked the name of the Queen Mother and, in doing so, have forced my hand. He walked back to his desk and picked up his phone. He scrolled through his contacts past names labeled logistics and acquisitions, until he found an old encrypted number he had not called in a decade. A number he had promised he would only ever call in a citywide crisis. He looked at Marcus. Get the Jones brothers. Not their phones. Not their assistants. Get them, bring them to the warehouse. I don't care what they are doing. Bring them to me, now. Marcus nodded and left the room. Isaiah Thorne stared at the contact on his phone. He knew what this meant. The old peace was broken. A debt had been incurred, and the old laws, the ones the Orchid had written in blood and fear, demanded that it be paid. He had no choice. He had to show his strength, his adherence to the code, even if it meant breaking the heart of the one person in the world he still truly feared. Damien was in his condo pouring himself a third glass of scotch, the liquid courage doing little to quell the frantic, panicked buzzing in his head. The entire confrontation with his mother replayed in an endless, horrifying loop, her cold eyes, the thug on his knees, the name, the Black Orchid. It was all nonsense. It had to be. She was his mother, a woman who grew flowers and tasted shrimp. She was playing a game, a sick, manipulative mind game to scare them off. He repeated this to himself over and over, but the lie was thin and frayed, and the terrifying image of Rico's face kept tearing through it. Caleb had fled to his own apartment across town, refusing to answer Damien's calls. He had sent a single frantic text, "We messed up, D. We messed up bad." A sharp, authoritative knock echoed from Damien's front door. It wasn't the soft tap of a courier or the buzz from the front desk. It was a knock that did not expect to be kept waiting. Annoyed, thinking it might be Caleb coming to his senses, Damien stalked to the door and pulled it open. Two men stood in the hallway. They were large, impeccably dressed in dark, tailored suits, and their faces were utterly devoid of expression. They were not cops. They were not businessmen. They were something else entirely. "Damien Jones?" the taller of the two men asked, though it wasn't a question. "Who's asking?" Damien shot back, trying to muster some of his usual arrogance. The man didn't answer. He simply looked past Damien into the apartment. "Mr. Thorne would like a word with you, and your brother. We'll be taking you to him now." Damien's blood ran cold. Mr. Thorne, Isaiah Thorne, the boogeyman, the name from the grimy back room of the po' boy shop. Suddenly the events in his mother's office didn't seem like a mind game at all. "I'm not going anywhere," Damien said, his voice trembling slightly. "You have no right." He didn't get to finish the sentence. The second man, who had been silent until now, moved with a speed that was shocking for a man his size. He stepped forward, grabbed Damien's arm in a grip of pure iron, and effortlessly propelled him out into the hallway. Damien's expensive Scotch glass slipped from his other hand and shattered on the polished concrete floor. The ride down in the elevator was silent. The two men stood on either side of him, their presence a suffocating weight. Out on the street, a black tinted window SUV was waiting at the curb, its engine humming. They put him in the back. A few minutes later, the car pulled up in front of Caleb's building, and the scene was repeated. Caleb, looking pale and terrified, was escorted out and pushed into the seat beside him. "What's happening, D?" Caleb whispered, his voice shaking. "I don't know," Damien lied, his own heart hammering against his ribs. The SUV didn't drive towards the central business district. It headed in the opposite direction, towards the industrial canals and the forgotten rusting skeletons of the city's old warehouses. It pulled into a vast, dark building, the metal roll-up doors sliding shut behind them with a deafening clang that sealed them in. They were pulled from the car and led into the center of the cavernous space. In the middle of the empty concrete floor, a single elegant chair was illuminated by a harsh spotlight from above. Isaiah Thorne was sitting in the chair, dressed in a bespoke suit, looking as calm and out of place as a panther in a dog kennel. Rico was kneeling on the floor a few feet away from him, his head bowed. Isaiah Thorne looked up as the two brothers were pushed before him. He studied them for a long moment, his eyes cold and analytical. He looked at their expensive clothes, their panicked faces, their soft, useless hands. He looked at them with the pure, undisguised contempt of a self-made king for two foolish princes. "The Jones boys," Isaiah said, his voice soft but echoing in the vast space. "The architects of my current headache." He gestured a hand towards Rico. "This one tells me you hired him to intimidate your mother, to force her to sign over her businesses. Is this true?" Damien's tongue felt thick and useless in his mouth. He couldn't speak. Caleb just stared at the floor, trembling. "I will take your silence as a yes," Isaiah continued. his voice dangerously calm. Normally the pathetic family squabbles of the city's elite are of no interest to me. But you gentlemen have made them my interest. You see, you didn't just hire a thug. You hired my thug. You used a piece of my organization, a piece of my power to disrespect the one person in this city to whom I owe a debt of peace. You disrespected the Black Orchid. He stood up and began to circle them slowly, like a shark. You probably don't even understand the gravity of your sin. You are children who have stumbled into a cathedral and spit on the altar. Your actions have made me look weak. They have made me look like a man who does not honor his treaties. In my world, that is a fatal perception. It is an insult that must be answered, publicly. He stopped in front of them, his eyes boring into Damien's. By the old laws, the laws that your mother wrote, your lives are now forfeit. You are a loose thread that threatens to unravel the entire tapestry, and I must cut that thread. The finality in his voice was absolute. This was not a negotiation, it was a death sentence. The words "your lives are now forfeit" hung in the cold cavernous air of the warehouse, as stark and final as a death certificate. For Damien and Caleb, two men who had spent their entire lives insulated by a cushion of wealth and privilege, the concept of their lives being forfeit was so alien it was almost incomprehensible. It was the language of movies, of a world they had only ever viewed from a safe distance. Now that world had reached out and wrapped its cold hard fingers around their throats. Caleb let out a small choked sob. The sound was pathetic in the vast, echoing space. All the fight went out of him, replaced by the terrified resignation of an animal in a trap. Damien, however, was still trying to find a way to talk his way out, to leverage a status he no longer possessed. Now wait a minute, he began, his voice a desperate cracking imitation of his usual confident tone. There's no need for this. We can pay whatever debt you think we owe. We can pay it. We're good for it. Just name a price. Isaiah Thorne actually laughed. It was not a pleasant sound. It was a dry, humorless rasp, like stones grinding together. A price? He said, circling back to his chair and sitting down, the picture of relaxed authority. You still think this is about money? You are children. This is about respect. It is about the balance of power. You have publicly insulted the very foundation of my authority. If I let you walk out of here with just a financial penalty, what message does that send to every other ambitious crew in this city? It tells them that Isaiah Thorne's treaties are negotiable. It tells them that the Orchid Sanctuary is not sacred. It invites chaos, and chaos is bad for business. He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his gaze pinning them in place. No, there is no price you can pay in dollars. The debt you owe must be paid in kind. It must be paid with risk, with fear, a demonstration of loyalty to the very structure you have threatened. He fell silent for a moment, letting them dangle in the terrifying uncertainty. Then he looked over at his second-in-command, Marcus. The Irish, Isaiah said. Marcus nodded. Still a problem. Their new shipment is due at the port tomorrow night. They've been getting bold moving product outside their territory. Isaiah turned his attention back to the brothers. There is a crew of Irishmen, led by a particularly unpleasant man named Finn O'Malley. They have become a thorn in my side. They believe we have grown soft. Tomorrow night, they are receiving a large shipment of illegal firearms at the St. Claude Wharf. A shipment I would very much like to acquire. He smiled, a cold, thin smile that held no warmth. So here is my offer. In exchange for your lives, you will go to the wharf tomorrow night. You will walk into the middle of their operation. You will tell Mr. O'Malley that his shipment now belongs to me, Isaiah Thorne. You will tell him it is a tribute he owes me for operating in my city. And then, you will supervise my men as they load the entire shipment onto our trucks. Damien and Caleb stared at him, the color draining completely from their faces. It was a suicide mission. Two soft, unarmed businessmen walking into a hornet's nest of violent Irish mobsters in the middle of an arms deal. They wouldn't last 30 seconds. They were being sent not to succeed, but to be made an example of. Their deaths would be the message. It is, I admit, a task with a low probability of success, Isaiah said, as if reading their thoughts. But your survival is not my primary concern. Your obedience is. If you succeed, your debt is paid. If you fail, well, the Irish will have solved my problem for me, and I will acquire their shipment by other more direct means. Either way, the balance is restored. He stood up, signaling the end of the audience. Marcus will give you the details. Be at the designated location tomorrow night. Or don't. My men will find you either way. The choice of how you wish to die is yours. He turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows of the vast warehouse without a backward glance. He left them standing there, two condemned men, their tailored suits suddenly feeling like burial shrouds. The arrogance, the ambition, the petty resentments against their mother, it had all burned away, leaving only the cold hard certainty of their own mortality. They had wanted to play in the world of real power, and now they had been given their roles. They were the pawns, destined to be sacrificed in the opening move of a game they had foolishly started. The two silent men drove Damien and Caleb back to the city and dropped them unceremoniously on a street corner in the warehouse district. Not far from the very spot where Damien had dreamed of building his nightclub, the glittering, trendy neighborhood now seemed menacing, its chic restaurants and art galleries casting long, dark shadows. The world that had once been their playground had become a hunting ground, and they were the prey. The moment the black SUV sped away, all the carefully constructed artifice between the two brothers shattered. "This is your fault," Caleb shrieked, his voice raw with terror and accusation. He shoved Damien hard in the chest. "Your ambition, your greed. Accelerate her retirement, you said. You've gotten us killed, Damien. We're dead." Damien stumbled back, his face a mask of shock and dawning horror. For the first time in his life, his younger brother was not looking at him with awe or deference, but with pure unadulterated hatred. "My fault," Damien shot back, his voice cracking. "You were right there with me, okay, D, let's do it. You said, you wanted this just as much as I did. Don't you dare try to put this all on me. I wanted to be respected," Caleb cried, tears of fear and frustration streaming down his face. "I didn't want to die in a shootout at the docks over some guns for a man we don't even know." "What were you thinking, bringing a man like that into Ma's house?" "I was thinking she was just an old woman," Damien roared, the confession finally torn from him, a raw admission of his own catastrophic misjudgment. "I thought she was weak. How was I supposed to know? How could any of us have known what she was?" Their argument was bitter and useless, the desperate finger-pointing of two drowning men fighting over a piece of driftwood. They stood on that street corner for nearly an hour, their fear curdling into a toxic stew of blame and despair. The reality of their situation was beginning to sink in. They couldn't run. Isaiah Thorne's reach was everywhere in the city. They couldn't go to the police. What would they say? And they certainly couldn't complete the mission. The very thought of facing down a crew of armed Irish mobsters was so absurd it was almost laughable. Finally, utterly broken, they retreated to Damien's cold, sterile condo. The shattered Scotch glass was still on the floor by the entryway, a fitting symbol of their ruined lives. They sat in the dark, the glittering city lights outside mocking their predicament, all their money, their connections, their supposed status, it was all meaningless. It couldn't save them. It was Caleb who said it first, his voice a dead, hollow whisper in the darkness. "There's only one person who can help us." Damien didn't answer. He didn't have to. They both knew who Caleb meant. The thought was galling, a humiliation so profound it was a physical pain. To go crawling back to the very woman they had tried to depose, to beg for help from the mother they had so profoundly disrespected. It was unthinkable. "No," Damien said, his voice thick with a pathetic vestigial pride. "Absolutely not. I will not." "Then we die," Caleb said simply, his voice devoid of emotion. "We die tomorrow night on a wharf, for nothing. Is your pride worth that? Damien, is it worth my life?" Damien looked at his younger brother. Truly looked at him and saw not the weak-willed follower but a terrified young man whose life he had gambled away. The last stubborn remnants of his arrogance finally crumbled, leaving only a raw, desperate fear. He was right. There was only one person in the world who moved in these circles, who spoke this language, who commanded this kind of power. One person who might be able to call off the wolves. With a shaking hand, Damien pulled out his phone. He scrolled through his contacts, his thumb hovering over the name that had been a source of resentment for so long and was now his only desperate hope. "Mom." He took a deep, shuddering breath and pressed the call button. He listened to the ring, each one a fresh wave of shame. She answered on the third ring. "Hello?" Her voice was calm, cool, and utterly unreadable. It was the voice of a stranger. "Ma," Damien began, his own voice cracking, the sound pathetic and weak even to his own ears. "Ma, it's me." He didn't know what to say, how to begin. He stumbled through the story, the words tumbling out in a panicked, incoherent rush. The summons, the warehouse, Isaiah Thorne, the Irish, The suicide mission. He explained the impossible situation they were in. The death sentence hanging over their heads. He didn't make excuses. He didn't try to justify their actions. There was no room left for lies. All that was left was the raw, ugly, terrified truth. When he was finished, the silence on the other end of the line was absolute. He could hear the faint sound of her breathing, calm and steady. She was listening. He had said everything. He had laid their stupidity and their desperation bare before her. He had thrown himself at her mercy. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he whispered the one thing he had never thought he would have to say to her, the words that signaled his total and complete surrender. "Ma, please, help us." I sat in my office, the phone pressed to my ear, listening to the terrified, broken voice of my eldest son. The grandfather clock in the corner ticked softly, each second a metronome marking the complete and utter dismantling of Damien's world. I listened to his panicked confession without interruption, my face impassive, my heart a cold, still stone in my chest. He told me everything. The summons by Isaiah's men, the cold, cavernous warehouse, the chilling pronouncement of their death sentence, the impossible, suicidal task at the wharf. As he spoke, I pictured the scene with a crystal clarity. I knew that warehouse. I had chosen it myself 20 years ago for its acoustics and its isolation. I knew Isaiah's methods, his flair for the dramatic, his belief in the theater of power. I had taught them to him. When Damien finally finished his plea, "Ma, please, help us," hanging in the silence, I did not feel the rush of maternal pity he was so desperately hoping for. Not at first. What I felt was a moment of profound, icy satisfaction. It was a cold and terrible feeling, and I did not shy away from it. This was the consequence. This was the lesson. They had wanted to play in the world of men, and now they were learning that the stakes were not just profits and losses, but life and death. They had learned finally that their mother was not just a woman who grew orchids. But the satisfaction was fleeting, a flicker of cold fire that was quickly extinguished by a deeper, more powerful and far more painful emotion. The primal, instinctual pull of a mother for her child. They were foolish. They were greedy. They had disrespected me in the most profound way imaginable. But they were my sons. They were Antoine's sons. They were the two small boys whose faces I had memorized as they slept in their cribs, whose futures I had sworn to protect with every fiber of my being. I looked across my desk at the photograph of my late husband. Antoine's kind, handsome face smiled back at me, his eyes full of the easy warmth and integrity that had so captivated me. What would he do? The answer was simple. He would have been heartbroken by their betrayal, but he would have moved heaven and earth to save his boys. He would have expected me to do the same. My promise to him, to leave that old world behind, to protect the beautiful garden we had built, was a sacred vow. But what he had never understood was that sometimes to protect a garden, you have to wade into the weeds and rip them out by the root. Sometimes you have to burn the fields to save the harvest. To save my sons, to save the legitimate world Antoine and I had built. I had to do the one thing I had sworn I would never do again. I had to step back into the life I had fought so hard to leave behind. I had to become the Black Orchid once more. The decision settled over me not with a sense of dread, but with a weary, grim resolve. My retirement had been a beautiful, peaceful decade, but it was over. My sons had in their stupidity dragged me back into the shadows, and now I would have to show them what it meant to truly command the dark. "Where are you?" I asked, my voice calm and devoid of either accusation or comfort. It was the voice of a strategist taking control of a chaotic battlefield. "I'm at my apartment," Damien stammered, his voice filled with a desperate, pathetic hope. "Caleb is here too." "Stay there," I commanded. "Do not leave the apartment. Do not answer your phones. Do not speak to anyone. I will handle it." "Handle it? Ma, how?" he asked, the first flicker of his old arrogance returning. The need to understand, to be in control. "You have lost the right to ask questions, Damien," I said, my voice cutting him off, the ice returning. "You will do exactly as I say. You will wait, and you will be silent. Is that understood?" "Yes," he whispered, all the fight gone from him. "Yes, Ma. Understood." I ended the call without another word. I stood up and walked to the French doors of my office, looking out at the darkening garden. The coming thunderstorm had finally broken, and a gentle rain was falling, washing the dust from the magnolia leaves, making the whole world look clean and new. My sons believed they needed a savior. They were wrong. A savior would offer them forgiveness and comfort. I would offer them neither. What they needed was a queen. And a queen does not forgive a rebellion. She quashes it, and then she re-establishes the order of her kingdom, ensuring that every subject from the highest lord to the lowest peasant understands precisely where they stand. I turned from the window and walked back to my desk. I picked up the phone. There was only one call I needed to make. One conversation that would determine the fate of my sons and the future of my family. I knew Isaiah would be expecting my call. The game had been set, the first move had been his. Now it was my turn. I let an hour pass. I calculated deliberate hour. An hour for my sons to stew in their terror, for them to fully comprehend the depths of their powerlessness. An hour for Rico to have delivered my message, and for Isaiah Thorne to sit in his glass tower, contemplating his next move, anticipating my call. In a negotiation, the person who can afford to wait always has the advantage. I wanted him to know I was not calling out of panic. I was calling to collect. When I finally dialed his private encrypted number, he answered on the first ring. "Saraphina," he said. His voice was a smooth, deep baritone, the voice of a man accustomed to command, but I could hear the subtle undercurrent of tension, of respect. He did not call me Orchid. That was a name for the street, for the myth. Between us, it was a different dynamic, the mentor and the student, the founder and the successor, the queen and the regent. "Isaiah," I replied, my voice cool and even. "It has been a long time. I trust you are well." "I was," he said, a hint of dry irony in his tone. "Until about 2 hours ago. I have to apologize for the disturbance at your home today. The fool who brought his ignorance to your door has been dealt with." "Dealt with?" I asked, my voice dangerously soft. "Do not mistake me, Isaiah. I care nothing for that boy Rico. He was a symptom. I am calling about the disease. My sons." There was a pause on his end of the line. "They are a problem," he admitted, his voice hardening. "They used my authority to commit an act of profound disrespect. They have threatened the stability I have spent 10 years building. A stability, I might add, that you entrusted to me." He was good. He was framing their sin not as an insult to me but as a threat to the order we both valued. He was reminding me of my own retirement, of the power I had ceded to him. "And you have dealt with this problem by sentencing them to death," I stated, my voice flat. It was not an accusation. It was a statement of fact. "I have dealt with it according to the old laws," he countered, his voice firm. "The laws you yourself established. An action must have a consequence. Respect is the currency of our world. Saraphina, your sons spent it all. I have offered them a chance to earn it back. A slim chance, I admit, but a chance. You have offered them a slaughter." I corrected him, my voice turning to ice. "You are sending 2 lambs to a wolf pack, not to test their strength, but to create a spectacle. You will use their deaths as a message to the Irish and to your own men. A message of your own strength, and you will do it with my children's blood." "It is a message that needs to be sent," he said, his voice unwavering. This was the heart of the negotiation. He was asserting his authority as the current Don Dom. He could not be seen as weak, as beholden to the old guard. To back down completely would be to lose face. I understood this. I had taught him this. So I could not demand. I had to negotiate. "The message will be sent," I said. "But you will not use my sons as the ink. The debt they have incurred is a family matter. And as the head of this family, I will assume it myself." "Assume it how?" he asked, a flicker of genuine curiosity in his voice. "You are retired, Saraphina. Your hands are clean." "My hands are never clean. Isaiah, you know that better than anyone," I said, letting a hint of the old cold power seep into my voice. "But this is not a debt to be paid with violence. It is a debt to be paid with something far more valuable. Do you remember the port expansion deal? 5 years ago?" The silence on his end of the line was now heavy, charged. I knew he remembered. It had been his first major test as a leader, a complex negotiation involving the city council, the unions and a rival faction. He had been on the verge of losing control, of a war breaking out on the docks. "I remember," he said, his voice cautious. "You remember that at the final hour, a certain anonymous donation was made to the police benevolent fund, and a certain set of compromising photographs landed on Councilman Miller's desk, convincing him to vote your way." I continued, my voice a soft silken threat. "You remember that the deal went through, solidifying your power for the next decade. You assumed it was your own clever maneuvering. It was not. It was my hand. moving the pieces on the board from a distance, ensuring the stability of the kingdom I had passed to you, a kingdom my sons were meant to inherit. In the light, not the dark. I let that sink in. I had just revealed that his greatest triumph was not his own. I had just reminded him that my reach, my influence had never truly vanished. That was my investment in your reign, Isaiah, I said, a favor I never intended to call in. Consider it called. The debt my sons owe you is cancelled. It is paid in full. They will not be going to the wharf tomorrow night. You will handle the Irish as you see fit, but you will do it with your own men, not my blood. The silence was long and profound. I could almost hear the calculations turning in his brilliant strategic mind. He was weighing his pride against his pragmatism. He was weighing the value of making an example of my sons against the danger of making an enemy of me. Finally, he spoke. The debt is paid, he said, his voice tight with a respect that had been forced, not given. Your sons are safe. From me at least. But Saraphina, you cannot put this genie back in the bottle. They have seen the other world. They have invoked your name. The peace you cherished is over. I am aware. I said, my voice cold as the grave. I will handle my house. You handle yours. We will not speak of this again. I hung up the phone. I had won. I had saved them. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the rain-swept garden. The storm had passed, but the air was still heavy. Isaiah was right. The peace was over. I had just bought my sons' lives, but the price was my own retirement. I had just traded my beautiful quiet garden for the dark thorny wilderness I had once called home. The queen was back on her throne, and her first act would be to deal with the traitors in her own court. The next morning I summoned my sons to the mansion. I did not call them myself. I had my housekeeper Estelle make the call, her voice imbued with a cold formal authority that would have been unmistakable. Your mother will see you in her office at 10 a.m. Do not be late. They arrived not together but in separate cars, a testament to the chasm of blame and fear that now lay between them. They walked into my office, and the change in them was profound. The arrogant, swaggering ambition was gone. The casual disrespect was gone. They were diminished, humbled, their expensive suits looking like ill-fitting costumes. They looked like what they were, two terrified boys who had stared into the abyss, and had been spared only by a power they could not comprehend. They stood before my desk, the same spot where they had stood just days before, trying to depose me. Today they did not look me in the eye. They stared at the floor, at their own expensive shoes, awaiting their sentence. I did not speak for a long time. I let the silence in the room become a third character, a heavy, suffocating presence that pressed down on their guilt. The grandfather clock ticked away the seconds of their new, borrowed lives. Finally, I moved. I picked up the leather-bound folder they had brought to me, the one containing the legal documents for their coup. I opened it and spread the papers across the polished surface of my desk. You wanted the family business, I said, my voice quiet, devoid of anger but filled with a chilling finality. You wanted to be in charge. You felt you were ready. Damien flinched. Caleb seemed to shrink even further into himself. It seems only fair, I continued, that you should get what you want. I took a heavy gold-plated fountain pen from my desk, Antoine's pen, and I uncapped it. With a few swift, elegant strokes, I began to sign the documents. Page after page. My signature, a series of sharp, confident angles, transferred ownership, power and control. I saw Damien's head lift slightly, a flicker of stunned, disbelieving hope in his eyes. Could it be this easy? Was he actually getting what he wanted? After all of this. When I had signed the final page, I neatly stacked the documents and pushed the folder across the desk towards them. There, I said. It's yours. Damien, you are the new president and CEO. Caleb, you are the executive vice president. Congratulations. They stared at the folder, then at me, their faces a canvas of utter confusion. This was not the reaction they had expected. But, I said, and the single word cut through the air, sharp and cold, I have taken the liberty of adding a new clause, a new bylaw to the corporate charter. Your lawyer, I'm sure, will agree it is ironclad. I slid a single, freshly printed page towards them. It was from my own lawyers, notarized and stamped that very morning. As of today, I explained, I am resigning from all day-to-day operational roles. However, I have created a new permanent position for myself. I am the sole permanent and irrevocable chair of the board, a position that holds absolute and final veto power over any and all decisions made by this company. Any sale, Any merger, any new venture, any expenditure over $50,000 requires my explicit written approval. Without it, your signatures are meaningless. I let them absorb the reality of their new positions. They were kings in name only. They sat on the thrones, but I held the scepter. They had the titles, but I had the power. You will not be playing with NFTs or cryo chambers, I informed them, my voice like silk and steel. You will learn this business from the ground up, the real business. You will learn about profit and loss, about payroll and unions, about supply chains and health inspections. You will work 12-hour days. You will learn the value of a dollar that has been earned, not given. You will learn the weight of the responsibility you so desperately wanted. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at my orchids, their vibrant colors a stark contrast to the gray reality I was imposing on my sons. The world you stumbled into, the world of Isaiah Thorne and men like him, is now closed to you, forever. You will never speak of it. You will never go near it. Your lives, from this day forward, will be entirely legitimate. That is your cage, and your salvation. I turned back to face them. Their faces were pale, but for the first time, a glimmer of understanding was dawning in their eyes. They finally understood. This was not a punishment. It was a penance. You wanted the family business, I said, my voice a soft, final whisper. Welcome to it. My retirement is over, your childhood is too. Now get out of my office. You have a long day ahead of you. The end. Thank you for watching.